Support for this podcast comes from Goldman Sachs. Companies in the top quartile for ethnic diversity are 33% more likely to have industry-leading profitability, and those in the top quartile for gender diversity are 21% more likely to outperform. This data was the catalyst behind Launch with GS, a $500 million investment strategy that continues to focus on increasing access to capital for women, Black, Latinx, and other diverse entrepreneurs. Learn more at gs.com/launchwithgs.
Empire. Want to get away? How does a good sailing adventure sound?
That even the director of such a live broadcast didn't really have an idea of who was leading at a given time, because the leaderboard is being assembled. Unlike, you can take split times at the turning marks, kind of like the split times you would have in skiing and other sports. But the interesting stuff is happening in between those mark roundings.
That's Marcus Baur, former Olympic sailor turned entrepreneur who's leading the innovative side of competitive sailing. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein. Marcus Baur is a German Olympian. He sailed in the 2000 and 2004 games. It's a sport that has trouble translating to broader audiences. Barrier of entry is still very high, and coverage of the events, it's hard to do inexpensively. But Baur sees solutions on both fronts, and while he isn't trying to take on the NBA for eyeballs, he knows his sport has a higher threshold of appeal. Our guest this week is Marcus Baur. He's a former Olympic sailor and entrepreneur who these days is working with SAP Global Sponsorships, having innovated many software and broadcasting solutions for the sport of sailing. And right now on planet Earth, there's nothing I could think of that I'd rather do than get on a boat and get away from it all. Hi, Marcus. How are you?
Hi, Bram. Pleasure to be here. Actually, I did get off a boat yesterday because we had a little family trip here in the Danish Baltic Sea. So it was pleasurable. I understand that that's something you want to do right now.
Marcus, I think for you, social distancing is not hard. It sounds like you've made a profession out of it for your entire life.
Well, going out on the water and having a sail is probably the healthiest thing you can do right now. And we did have some major regattas that happened with actually a lot of participants. But since everybody goes out on the water and sits on the boat more or less by himself, there's teams of one sailor up to maybe 3, 4, 5, but it's not a huge crowd. It's a good way to social distance, actually.
And it's become part of your business future as well. Tell us a little bit about your partnership with SAP and what you're doing with them.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually a trained architect, like bricks and mortar architecture, but I finished my studies and put my Olympic campaign and aspirations to rest. I got involved in software development, and I've always thought that sailing is a sport that is actually interesting to follow. And, when I was sailing, there was barely any media attention on the sport at all because it was just too hard to follow. And around, 10 years ago, we approached SAP with the idea of changing that. And an amazing cooperation has resulted from that. The CEO at that time and one of the founders were very excited about that idea. They were sailors themselves. And we started using technology that you would use in a business environment to actually making the sport of sailing more understandable. And everything we're doing now came from that basic idea. Let's use technology to make sailing more understandable for the sailors themselves in their training environments, but also for spectators and fans.
So what do you mean by that? Make it more understandable? Well, and let's start with the people who are on the boats. What did they need to have in front of them to make it more understandable that would make the experience better?
Well, for them, it's actually not that hard. The ones who understand the sport the best are the sailors themselves. But any outsider, and that's even including coaches, it is really hard to understand the race. And that's because it's not linear. In sailing, the sailors decided that they didn't want to start and race just from point A to point B, but they actually decided that they want to sail straight into the wind. And no boat, as you probably know, can sail straight into the wind. That's physically impossible. So you actually have to make a decision whether you want to head to the left side or to the right side of the course. And they always differ. And that opens up a really interesting strategic and tactical game that sailors understand well. But if you look from the outside, it's sometimes impossible to spot who's actually leading. So the big change is for anybody looking from the outside. But for the sailors, the reality used to be that there was no recording of their race and no recollection possible. They only had their memories. So you always saw these sailors standing on shore and making gestures of how they went left and right and did this or that. But, there was no record of that. So the big change for the sailors is that now when they come back ashore, there's a record of what they did because we track every boat with GPS devices and then plot that onto a map and run analytics on it. And we can do that live. And that's the big game changer for the spectators, that they can follow the race live and make sense of it.
So where was the problem in the past in attempting to, I don't know if broadcast it is the right way to put it, but get the race into the hands of the consumer? What was missing there that wasn't for them to be able to experience?
Well, sailing there were always attempts to point a camera at the action. At the Olympics, there were budgets to run a live broadcast. There were helicopters up in the air. They even had onboard cameras. But a camera doesn't tell you the story. At least it doesn't tell you the whole story. It gives you beautiful pictures, sailing boats, competing sailors. That's always good to look at. But if you can't make sense of the competition because you don't see exactly how boats position towards each other, it becomes really confusing. And the reality in the past was that even the director of such a live broadcast didn't really have an idea of who was leading at a given time because the leaderboard is being assembled. Unlike, you can take split times at the turning marks, kind of like the split times you would have in skiing and other sports. But the interesting stuff is happening in between those mark roundings. And the director wouldn't have a clue where to send the helicopter or the camera boat because he didn't know who was leading. And what we started with 10 years ago was we need a live leaderboard that considers the wind direction, because it's really the wind that is never completely stable. Even stable sailing conditions is when the wind shifts 5 degrees, 10 degrees from left to right. And that changes the leaderboard because, when boats head out to the different sides, they can shorten the distance to the next mark through these wind shifts. Now, the director didn't know who was leading, so he sent the camera boat to someone who looked like he was that was in the lead. And at the next mark, that boat turns out in his place. Tell a story on that without confusing the viewer. So the big game changer was we calculate a live leaderboard. And no, this is not split times. Every second it gets updated, considering the wind direction. So we always have an up-to-date status of where the race is. That has been a technology that was used at very, very few regattas before we started our effort. The America's Cup was one of them. It was very costly to do that. And we made the technology more accessible and more affordable. And now we're taking the final step where we really want to make it available for any sailing regatta in the world.
Support for this podcast comes from AT&T. All right, so there are a lot of reasons to like AT&T 5G. Check this out. My friend Lisa, who's a professional race car driver and base jump wingsuit enthusiast, likes AT&T 5G because it's fast. My friend Terry, who's a bodyguard who once also wrestled a hyena when he got too close to his client on safari, likes AT&T 5G because it's secure. And my friend Sasha, who's a librarian and hasn't missed a day of work in 27 years, Ooh, not even that time she broke both her legs and had the measles? Likes AT&T 5G because it's reliable. Switch to AT&T 5G. It's fast, secure, and reliable. And now nationwide. AT&T 5G. It's not complicated. 5G requires a compatible plan. 5G may not be in your area. See att.com/5G for you for 5G coverage details.
Is the goal of some of this as well to make this more accessible to people who might have interest in sailing, or is this kind of directed at the people who are already into the sport and involved in the sport?
I look at it as the beginning of a development that a lot of other sports took probably 50 years ago. You know, when the first television channels started pointing cameras at football fields and baseball fields, there was an interest in the public to follow these games, and these games lended themselves well to this 1, 2, 3 camera perspective kind of storytelling. And as a result of that, huge communities were built and generated around that. Sailing is only now at that point where that's technically possible at a reasonable price. And naturally, there's not huge communities following that. And we're only seeing the beginning of that happening. And naturally, you start with friends and family and sailing enthusiasts. But we do see that there's a couple of nations in the world already which are very, very excited about the sport. Like New Zealand is one example, or France is one example. New Zealand, obviously, because they're a small nation and they won the America's Cup. And for them, it's like rugby, you know, like the number one sport. They take very great interest in the sport. So I think we're at the beginning of the community building around following sailing. But, you know, once you get into it, it is an exciting sport to follow and to understand, because it is an interesting strategic and tactical battle that lends itself really well to good storytelling if the storyteller, the commentator, has the right data at hand.
Is there another sport that you compare it to in terms of marketing and what we're talking about, which is growing reach and interest in the sport? Is there some other sport that you look at that you go, we should follow their lead, and that's how we should go about trying to market what we're doing here?
You know, with the dawn of the internet, new niches opened up that didn't exist before. When we looked at the media landscape 20 years ago, it was basically, there was no niche that would open up so that a new sport could kind of slip in, because the television channels had all their slots booked. Basically, there was it differed from country to country, but in Germany it was pretty much football, what you call soccer. And then it was Formula One racing, and that was it. You know, those were the big sports. And then the Olympics came in and the Football World Cup. But that was that. I wouldn't compare sailing to dart at all, but dart is an interesting phenomenon because it completely took off, at least in Europe, in some markets where there's huge attention for that sport. Esports is another example. All of a sudden, these esports communities fill stadiums. So I'm more interested in that part. You know, how can a new niche grow into something substantial and build fan communities around that? Since the phenomenon is relatively new, that these new niches open up, I don't see a clear role model of how that can happen. But I think it's important to note that we're still at that point where very few events could afford that conclusive, understandable storytelling around a regatta. We've taken it from the America's Cup to the World Cup racing, and we're now also in cooperation with the Olympic sailing regatta. And you know, we portrayed about 80 regattas per year up until now. And now with the Sail Insight app effort, we can dramatically grow that number in the coming years and basically the beginning of the community growth. So I don't have maybe you know more about it. You maybe follow the sport landscape in other areas, more of sports that have broken through in the past years. The example that I could come up with was dart. I don't know if you followed that a little bit.
Yeah, I know how it kind of exploded in kind of that niche realm. And then all of a sudden they were presenting it, I guess, I don't know if differently. It might just be the internet that really helped them. I do see a similar kind of a connection to surfing on some level, that there's the beauty of it, and its accessibility is hard to get to. You're in a vast landscape. You're in locations all over the world. You're asking a lot of broadcasters to go and cover the events, and it's a mammoth type of expedition to try to cover it correctly, as you're describing. So I think it's kind of similar there. There's some similarities there.
For sure. And I think they've reached quite a substantial market and crowd with their content. Again, it's relatively simple to portray compared to sailing, because you put a camera on the beach and that camera swings left and right. And then, all the rest is a beautiful add-on when you have a drone flying over the surfer. Actually, a good example of the potential is what we're doing right now. We're having a podcast. 20 years ago, we would have talked about this for 90 seconds, and it would have been a snippet inside a linear TV channel. And now we see that people are actually interested in long-form content and more complex content. And that it was probably more the medium that dictated brevity and short attention spans than the viewer, who is actually quite accepting to long form content now that goes in depth. So I think with sports like sailing, you will see that they will never generate the size of communities like the major sports do now, but they will create very robust niches of very interesting communities that follow with a lot of passion. So I think we're looking at an age of diversity in sports, which I think is a good thing.
Yes, the internet has offered the opportunity to service audiences of all sizes, and they can be robust and they can be valuable. They don't have to be the size of the National Football League or the NBA. They can be other sized audiences as well, which I think, as you know, in sailing. I wonder, have you had any experience with either AI or that type of technology as you try to think about the future of presenting sailing?
Well, depends on what you call AI. It's a really wide topic, but we've looked at automating things. We've experimented with automatically flying drones, for example, to make the portrayal easier, because you need a skilled drone pilot to fly the camera so that it tells the story well, or you automate that because we have the GPS data of the boat, and you have the drone follow the boats automatically, and by that be in the right position at all times. These are ideas but that's it's not core to the mission anymore. What was core to the mission is that we have live leaderboard information, and that we plot the race and each individual boat onto the playing field and make a commentator understand what's going on so he can translate it into a meaningful portrayal and commentary for the viewer.
I'll let you go with this. I'm just curious. We've had the opportunity to talk to former Olympians, and this was an extremely unusual event that has occurred this year, and the Olympic Games had to be delayed because of it. What was your general reaction to not having the games in Tokyo this year?
Yeah, I mean, we were scheduled to be intimately involved in it because the solution is going to be used at the Olympics as the live leaderboard generating a solution. And obviously, I've always been following the Olympics. That was obviously super unusual, and hopefully it's not going to drag on. We do hope that we can have the Olympics next year. As someone who has competed into Olympic Games, I know the blood and soul that you put into an Olympic campaign, and for the whole thing getting called off is a tragedy for an athlete. I hope that that's not going to happen. I think it's an incredibly important event for humanity. They once had, when I was competing in the Olympics, they had the beautiful slogan called "Celebrate Humanity," and I think we need that more than ever in these times. Yeah. And I very much hope that it's going to take place. It's going to happen next year, and I obviously also hope it's going to be a good milestone for sailing, because the sailing venue in Oshima, south of Tokyo, is spectacular.
You can check out sapsailing.com, and you can check out the work of Marcus Baur, architect, sailor, and former Olympian. Thank you so much for joining us, Marcus.
Thanks, my pleasure.
Support for this podcast comes from AT&T. All right, so to stay connected, AT&T Business has the only wireless plan your teams need. With mobile hotspot data up to 100 gigabytes, they can easily use their phones to connect tablets and laptops to the internet from really virtually wherever work takes them, giving them the power to boost productivity even on the go. Upgrade to AT&T Business and get our best plan with nationwide 5G and 100 gigabytes in mobile hotspot data. Visit att.com/business elite. Terms and conditions apply.
On the next Future Sport podcast, using the science of racing to educate the mathematicians of tomorrow.
Through partnering with iRacing, we're challenging students that already work with 1080 Education programs to compete in an online sort of e-learning competition where they have to actually not just compete using the iRacing service, but they have to design, build, prototype programs in their own game peripherals, like a simulator kit with the steering wheel and the pedals, like the ones that you might buy.
That's IndyCar driver Dalton Kellett, whose passion off the track is helping kids who are like him, competitors with a desire to know the why behind the G-forces. That will do it for this episode. As always, the future is now. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein. The Future Sport Podcast is brought to you by 3 Advance, developers of sports tech apps that are AI-powered and UX-focused. So if you're looking to create some apps for your startup or your sports biz calls for some artificial or business intelligence, you should check out 3 Advance. They're incredible. Go to 3advance.com. That's the number 3advance.com.